Good afternoon. Great and wonderful welcome from Davos, from the World Economic Forum. Namibia is participating at the World Economic Forum, and we welcome you and thank you so much for joining us. I want to welcome everyone in the room this afternoon and also all the people who are on the live broadcast. Please pose your questions online. You are very welcome. Today we will be discussing enabling a rapid transition to a more globally competitive Namibia. And I'm joined by Honorable, I almost said Honorable.
Not quite.
No. Okay. So Honorable Ipumbushimi could unfortunately not join us, and he sends his apologies, but we have found somebody just as capable to speak on competitiveness, James Newpie. He's the advisor to the president, the economic advisor to the president, and also the Green Hydrogen Commissioner. And also next to him is Oscar Kapelau. He is the Chief Financial Officer for the First Rand Group Namibia. And Conrad Dempsey, the CEO, Chief Executive Officer for First Rand Group Namibia. And today we really hope to have a great discussion around competitiveness and how we can make Namibia more competitive. This morning in preparation, I read something interesting. It says national prosperity is created and not inherited. And it does not grow out of a country's natural endowments, its labor pool, its interest rates, or its currency's value, as classical economists insist. But it's rather a national's competitiveness depends on the capacity of its industry to innovate and upgrade. And companies gain advantage against the world's best competitors because of pressure and a bit of challenge. And I think we've come out of a very challenging time the last 2 years with COVID-19 hitting many economies. And how do we come out of that and make Namibia competitive? So I'm going to start off the panel discussion. I'm going to ask Conrad Dempsey, with capital being increasingly mobile, how can smaller developing economies like Namibia actually compete globally?
Great, thanks, and good morning. Morning, everybody here, and also those back home and others dialing in. Margaret, yes, I think that's really the question that sits on so many developing economies' minds at the moment, globally. You know, when you travel around some of the more developed economies, you think, how do we as a small nation state with such a small economy, how do we compete on this global stage? And I think, if you start to unpack this competition that we talk about, the mind usually goes towards economic capital and financial capital. But I think as we would have seen with some of the sort of future projects we're taking on in the country, the competition for future skills, human capital, is becoming more and more difficult. I was earlier this morning listening to a previous presentation of James, and you look at the complexity that Namibia is taking on and our ability to attract the right skills for that. So I think the last 2 years taught us one or two things on competitiveness. I think the rules have changed, and the rules have changed fundamentally and forever. And in some ways, leveling the playing field for smaller economies to compete. There's definitely a better appreciation around the need for global solutions on the global problems, which means, climate immediately comes to mind, and there's others. But these sort of approaches are a lot less border bound. And the ways of work also means that industries are also becoming less border sensitive. So I think that the fundamental change we've seen in business models and in the way we're tackling the problems globally means that there's real opportunity for us. And I think emerging economies can definitely benefit from it. The downside, though, is that I think we do need more openness and less tariffs globally. Emerging economies are really hurt by the increasing, worrying, protectionist approach that we see around the planet. But yeah, I think if you sort of take a pure competitive approach, you say, when you compete in anything in life, you play to your strengths. Mm-hmm. And as a country, what does playing to our strengths mean? And it's something we think about a lot. In First Rand, our stated purpose is to help build a globally competitive Namibia. And I suppose it's all about how countries manage their competencies to create and achieve that long-term sustainable value that you referred to earlier. And if one sort of start to to understand that playing to your strengths, then a lot of the presentations this week starts to make sense.
Yeah.
You know, the great ambitions on green hydrogen that we'll be hearing about a lot, that's essentially a country saying, you know, I've got a great untapped renewable energy potential, which is a strength that I've got, and I'm going to use that strength to compete and help solve a global problem to decarbonize the planet a bit more.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I like what you said about the global solutions for global problems and renewable energy from a Namibia point of view. We lend ourselves so well. So it's really a matter of how well we're innovating as a country. We're finally looking at our asset base. Sun, I know it sounds weird, but it's an asset that we have that other countries don't have. Our sun and a lot of wind in the south, and we're putting together this massive industry that, you know, really putting us out there as a country and saying, you know, we're ready to compete with the big players. So Oscar, as a major investor yourselves and a systemic market participant in the Namibian economy, can you perhaps give us an overview of how Namibia currently fares on global competitiveness as an investment destination?
If we look at how Namibia fares, Namibia actually fares fairly well. We had a respectable score when we look at the last detailed competitiveness report that was issued. Namibia has a very sound financial system, well regulated. Again, we can refer to the financial stability report that was recently issued by the central bank. The banking sector remained liquid, profitable, and well capitalized during the pandemic-induced recession. And we are not strangers to themes as inclusive growth, shared value, ESG, Basel banking regulatory framework, IFRS, environmental stability, financial inclusion. So when we look at the financial sector, I mean, we are also up there. When it comes to governances, regulatory framework, all those things, we are definitely competitive. And we continue to attract the right talent to the sector. Conrad touched on, again, already on human capital, but if we look at the banking sector, I mean, we are able to pull in youngsters, I mean, in the digital space, again, fourth industrial revolution. I mean, yes, we are pulling in the right talent to, again, support what we are trying to drive from a competitiveness. And as the economies grow more complex, the financial sector needs to keep pace, and banks need to grow and become more sophisticated. So again, when we look at our competitiveness currently and zooming into complexity of our economy. And as it grows, definitely we are an enabler to what we are currently busy with.
Thank you so much. I just want to touch on, and maybe I hope I'm not throwing anybody a curveball, but you mentioned something about inclusive growth. How does that actually impact competitiveness? And how do you measure that in a world where we're saying we want to be competitive? What does that mean, inclusive growth? I don't know, any one of you can take it. James?
Yeah, so I think, you know, one of the things that the government is doing holistically is when it's looking at these ambitions that we just spoke about that are big, they're essentially beyond Namibia on its own. And so from an inclusive growth perspective, one could look at it in a couple of ways. If you look at HPP2, it'll talk about economic diplomacy. Economic diplomacy is certainly the government reaching out to regional neighbors and international neighbors to work together to engender the result that we need for the region and the world. But at the same time back home, it means that when you're actually trying to put together policies, you're trying to put together policies that will speak to the micros, the small and the medium enterprises as well, and not just for big corporate. And sometimes that can be things like tax policy, but it can also be things like education policy. So making sure that the skill sets that are needed, whether it is for IR or whether it is, you know, putting out scholarships for young people to get into the synthetic fuels industry, that is done in a manner that really spreads out those opportunities right across the country. And then lastly, and we'll talk about it some more later on, in terms of where you source your skills, you know, we did a specific piece of research with the Harvard Growth Lab that was looking specifically at the immigration policy, and I'll speak about that more as well. sometimes you do need some specialist skills that when they are brought in and deployed appropriately, they actually then unlock opportunities for many other Namibians, not just to learn that skill, but to then do specific jobs or get into specific industries, and that multiplier effect goes out. So inclusive growth is actually quite multifaceted. There's an international aspect to it, there is a policy and a local aspect to it, but there's also an education and a skills perspective to it as well.
Okay. No, that's great. I think we need to understand it in that broader field, because I think competitiveness gives us that opportunity to grow our economies, to not only make when we are competitive as a country, our country prospers. So I think it was just a question that I needed to ask just to show how that plays out. And so, James, a discussion on competitiveness invariably includes a view of enabling policy direction, which you just touched on. Can you please give us a broader overview of Namibia's positioning where that's concerned?
Yeah. And so, I mean, typically when one starts looking at competitiveness, and the Ministry of Finance, again, I really wish he was here because he's very passionate about this. Mm-hmm. The Ministry of Finance, the National Planning Commission, I see the DGs in the room, and of course the central bank have actually come together and they said, look, let's not plan in isolation. And they've formed what they call a Committee on Policy Coordination. Mm. And that CPC is looking at the broader growth agenda, of course, inclusiveness, competitiveness as well. And some of the work that they're doing, for example, with regards to competitiveness, looks at those incentives. So what incentives does Namibia have today versus its peers, right? Yeah. Especially regionally. And you've seen some very spirited debates within Namibia, and I think really one has to commend the private sector and the public sector. So specifically on NEPA, for example, we didn't always agree, but again, we were willing to pause and listen to each other and take input. So I know that when I spoke to the CEO of the NIPDB, the Namibian Investment Promotion Development Board, we are expecting that Investment Promotion Act to really sort of be finalized sometime. Next year, we are going to be working extremely hard to put together a set of special economic zones. Okay. What you could see this morning when we were talking about the synthetic fuels, you saw us beginning to identify hydrogen valleys. Mm-hmm. Those would be very prime opportunities to start putting up special economic zones around those valleys. Yeah. And then, of course, designing legislation. So we'll be putting in place a Synthetic Fuels Act, designing legislation that then enables economic activities around those. And so that speaks to incentives, the special economic zone. The other thing that is very important is while we wait for NEPA and the SEZ regime to come through, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Industrialization and Trade, of course, in conjunction with the CPC and the Cabinet Committee on Treasury.
Sorry, James, just what is the CPC?
Yeah.
So that we are...
I did mention in the beginning, maybe I said it too fast. Committee on Policy Coordination.
Awesome. Thank you.
You see, the crowd knows. They were listening. And there is the central part of it right there. That's DG Kanjo there, National Planning Commission. Mm-hmm. So he's really the chair of that. And he's brought in the chief economist of the country, central bank governor, and the money man himself, whom I'm trying to represent today, but I'm doing an okay job of, I think. But Ipumbo Shimi. So those three principles are sitting down and coordinating policy. But what I was going to say is, instead of waiting for those two big pieces of legislation, NIPDB and MIT, Ministry of Industrialization and Trade, are pushing for a transitionary package of incentives as well, just to really get capital flowing and to get those incentives out there. The one last thing I will say is I was privileged enough to be in a discussion. This was actually at COP, so basically the top 4 leaders of the country. And they had challenged our economic leaders to say, when we look at the region, Rwanda, South Africa actually have a piece of legislation that identifies strategic investments. Yeah. And those strategic investments are defined by their quantum, either in terms of job creation, potential, FDI, and they're treated in an idiosyncratic manner that reflects their strategic nature. And I know it was something that Cabinet has been asked to look at. Should we be looking to put in place a strategic investment policy? And it might be part of those transitory packages that we'll put together. So we are doing a few things on competitiveness. I think the last one is an immigration bill that is being looked at as well. Again, we've identified skills as being an important enabler, but allowing targeted skills to come in is just as important, not just building your own. And I know that the Namibian Investment Promotion Board in particular actually were putting together a desert visa program, which was very attractive. Essentially, it would allow for highly skilled people to get expedited visas. You could actually allow for high net worth individuals to be able to, for example, get permanent residence in Namibia. So very progressive thinking. Things we're seeing in Canada, New Zealand, Portugal. We're looking to learn from them and deploy it in Namibia. And I'm excited to see how that comes out.
Okay, thank you so much, James. And I guess just what you were talking about with regards to policy, and I want to ask, maybe it's a chicken and egg story, but what is the best way to do it? Does the policy come first based on our goals that we have as a country, or do you start the industry and put the policy in place? And I mean, please, I would like to have the full panel give its view on that from a competitiveness point of view. And it's something that everybody has been asking us back home, is what comes first? Do we create an industry and then create the policy? Or do we have these goals, put the policies in place and then create the industry? Or does it not matter?
So Margaret, I'll give you my view. I think with any of these things, the more clearer you are on the rules of the game, the easier it is to attract players onto the field. So my view is really, policy needs to lead. Does it need to be absolutely perfect day one? Probably not. And one can always tweak and recalibrate as you go. And to wait until everything is absolutely perfect before we start moving is probably also not the right approach. But I do think a set of very clear guidelines and sort of rules to play by definitely makes it a lot easier to get people going.
Awesome.
What I just wanted to add, yes, these are not the easy stuff. There are no templates out there. I mean, that's what great scholars will tell you. So, I mean, yes, we would want things done yesterday or by latest end of business today. But yes, they do take time, and it's just the acceptance that, as Conrad mentioned, I mean, these things need to be clear, but unfortunately, there are no templates that one can just tick the boxes and say, there it is, let's run. So there is time that one must accept these things take, but definitely it's having that vision and as a country knowing where we are headed to.
Awesome.
I think if I can add to that, so again, this is what the CPC is doing, so we can borrow from what they're doing. There's a concept of a regulatory sandbox. Yeah, so you're actually building the regulation in response to a growing and evolving industry as well, right? So just as Conrad said, you're not waiting for everything to be perfect and write a piece of legislation. You write a bill, you engage with the players, you engage with the players as they are growing as well, and then you're willing to change. I think that's one of the toughest thing for us regulators is we think once an act is an act, if you change it, it means you were imperfect, you didn't think it through. And it takes a certain amount of courage and self-assurance to be willing to change with not just with the flow, but with the global dynamic. So what we're seeing, for example, on our side with the synthetic fuels industry, it requires that level of courage because that industry is changing rapidly. You could see what happened post-Ukraine. Things got accelerated, so we had to move with that pace. But in other areas as well, especially with our PPP Act. Our PPP Act came out. It is very robust and scholarly sound, but it appears as if, our economy wasn't taking it up. And so we've had to adjust. So we're coming up with new guidelines, for example, on unsolicited proposals to allow the private sector to start suggesting ideas to the public sector. So that regulatory agility and flexibility is super useful and is needed.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we are talking about investments and how Namibia wants to attract investors, especially in an environment where either we are very competitive or we're building ourselves towards becoming competitive. So I want to go back to Oscar as a CFO. If you look at an enabling and established financial and capital market system, we know that it's a much needed element for an economy to actually compete. So can you provide an overview of what this looks like for investors into Namibia?
Let me go back to the framework, how the competitive index was built. I mean, if we again zoom into the financial systems pillar, there we scored very well. I mean, above the mean of 50. And if you allow me to zoom into First Rand, we primarily go to market with two brands. F&B and R&B, where F&B is our retail and commercial arm, and then in the R&B space, this is where we do our corporate and investment banking. And in R&B, we have the expertise to advise how to access capital markets. I mean, again, even internally, we service different arms. Earlier in March, F&B went to market assisted by R&B in terms of our inaugural green bond that we listed. I mean, this was well received, oversubscribed. So the banking sector in Namibia is world-class, continues to move ahead with digitalization, transformation. So financial markets, yes, it's well developed. We are ready to support economic growth in Namibia. The competition is tough by all the players. I mean, paper can be listed on the local exchange to broaden again participation. When we spoke earlier of inclusive growth, and this was saying, yes, it's not private placement only of paper. Again, on the exchange, it would give broader access to a variety of players, and again, also bring in transparency of pricing. Because I mean, banks can't do it all. I mean, therefore, we need to see how other ways can we get capital to back all these projects that are continuously in the pipeline.
Awesome. So that means basically our financial pillar, just looking at at least the World Economic Forum's competitiveness rankings, that Namibia is doing fairly well in. If you look at other pillars, and I can ask James or Conrad to just add, if you look at other pillars such as our small population, how will that actually impact investors? And how can we create other markets? How does Namibia actually lend itself to step out of that?
So I think from my perspective, and it is something again we do debate quite intensely within government. The 2.5 million people is not going to cut it, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at how we are positioning various sectors, even I mean, I'll speak later on about some of the infrastructure that we're looking to build, the ports. We're targeting the hinterland. We're targeting trading with global partners. If we look at the synthetic fuels, we're targeting exporting that to either the neighbors or again into Europe. If you look at our renewable energy, the government isn't just looking at becoming self-sufficient anymore, right? The NIRP is about getting to self-sufficiency, but now we're beginning to dream about exporting electrons into the SAPP. That's a totally different mindset, and you're beginning to serve SADC versus Namibia. So I think Namibia becoming an export hub, but not just for commodities, right? Mm-hmm. But for services as well. And that's why you're going to need to be dynamic about the skills is important. I think lastly, what we're going to try and do with the EIF that we're going to be announcing tomorrow, we have such a dynamic financial services sector, right? Obviously, given the proximity to our neighbor to the south. But some of our work within green bonds, carbon credits that I hear that we're going to be looking to develop, those are skills that Namibia has and not many African countries have. And I've seen us beginning to export those. And lastly, I can tell you, Namibians are now working in Mauritania. Namibians are now working in East Africa, all on the back of our renewable energy efforts. And it's amazing to see, guys like Elmo from Otessa, Yalo, all these guys are now selling and exporting what we're building in Namibia. Margaret is doing it in Mauritania, and that's amazing. And I think with the hydrocarbons coming into play soon with our colleagues from Shell and Namcor and, of course, Total as well, that begins to lend our economy to become more export-orientated in nature as well.
Yeah. And I mean, from a market point of view, in terms of attracting other sectors, how can we? How does that sort of impact our competitiveness? Are we lending ourselves to actually creating different markets? So make the product in Namibia, sell it elsewhere. What is available at this stage? Conrad?
Yeah, Margaret, that's a whole day's discussion at that point. But if you look at, you go back to some of the work that the Harvard Growth Lab did and other work with national planning, I think also did a lot of work around it. Is this need for diversification of the economy.
Yeah.
Namibia's economy is not a one-trick pony. Resource-based for a very long time. And I think it's quite important to understand that as we talk about these future ambitions of the country, that it's not just a green hydrogen story.
Yeah.
There's so many other and alternative industries that is getting developed, either independently or as a result of. And I think that flip that James referred to, of flipping towards a more export-orientated economy. I think we realize that as a consumption-based economy, with a small population, you're never really going to get there.
Yeah.
So no, I do think the actions are lining up for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, to get into the various sectors and subsectors of it, I think we're probably going to be cut short on time there.
Thanks, Conrad. Yes, we have a massive dream as a country, I think, like every other country. And if I come back to you, Conrad, all countries want a better tomorrow. And every single country, like any other business or everyone involved in just pure economics, they want to make their plans a reality, not only have a big dream, as Namibia has, but we also want to make sure our plans become a reality. Why do you believe investors can look at Namibia with confidence that the path of shared prosperity is actually achievable?
Margaret, it's a question we get a lot. And I think, if you would attend a session this morning, quite cold, and your first time listening to Namibia on stage, you'll hear a lot of talks about dream, and we're planning to, and we're looking at, and we're developing. And then, rightfully people would say to us, but, can you actually deliver on this stuff? Because that really was differentiating economies that do get to grow themselves out of predicaments that they might be in. And it's something that we've reflected on quite a bit to think, why is it that we think Namibia is on the path to actually get this right? And you're right, it's all about a better tomorrow, and it's not just something that Namibia thinks about hard. The World Bank recently released some data that said in 1990, 25% of the people that lived in poverty lived in Africa. At the moment, it's estimated around 70%. And they estimate by 2030, it could be as much as 90%. So there's an absolute real imperative to have to get this right. And it's really not just a Namibia story, but I think with the focus on Namibia, there's also a real realization that aid is not going to solve it, not for us and not for others. And that is why also some of the plans that you see looks ambitious and looks big. Because the only way to really get on that trajectory is to get multi-decade high growth. And multi-decade high growth doesn't come from a little tweak here and there. It comes from being bold, it comes from being assertive, and putting big dreams on screens in Davos and talking about it, and then making it happen. And I think as a collective, when you talk to whether it's private sector or public sector in Namibia, there's a real collective that we want to make this work. We also do realize that there's no silver bullet for economic growth. If there was a silver bullet plan for economic growth, it would have been quite easy, and we would have painted by numbers and have it in place. And I think, when I talk about that sort of collective confidence that the country is taking forward, it's not about perfect economics or getting all the institutions perfect or getting all the policies perfect first before we can start. I think it's rather more about that collective fundamental commitment of senior government, senior business leaders and our partners to make it work. And I think it's about an understanding of execution, which is really getting crystallized quite nice and clear in terms of how does the CPC look at it to enable? How do we get the competitive enablers to go? What is the role of each of us to make this happen? And yes, then continuously understanding what do we need to tweak to keep moving Namibia's competitive posture up.
Yeah.
And I think we might have an announcement the next day or two as well around some of the additional resourcing that we'll be able to get as a country to understand where do we need to do more tweaking. Yeah. So no, I think we're particularly confident about the ability to actually make this work. And yes, to make mistakes and to learn and to tweak as we go. But yeah, a very exciting time.
Yeah. No, very exciting times indeed for Namibia. And what I'm hearing from you is execution will be very key for Namibia moving forward, even though we've got these massive dreams as a country, and then agreeing on a common vision. Like, this is where we're going, and collectively agree that we want to do it. And then what's the best plan for that plan to actually unfold itself? It doesn't mean there's a textbook, as Oscar was saying, there's no textbook answer for it. It's what will work for Namibia. And so I want to just dive into the green hydrogen discussion. We've been talking about it. That's the reason why Namibia is at Davos this year. And our ambitions around creating this industry. But Namibia is much more than just a one-trick pony. James, I'm going to pose this question to you. So can you give us a sense of the attractive investment opportunities that are ready now? I know we had a discussion just earlier on, and if you could just give a few highlights of that.
No, absolutely. There's a lot more going on in Namibia than just green hydrogen, and I can tell you, I'm not sure there are many government workers who've worked as hard as we are working today. I know the DG is nodding because it's true. And let's take it a couple. So, as we speak, the National Container Terminal is actually out on concession, right? And you will see the HPP2, the Harambee Prosperity Plan 2, talks very much about government proactively going out to look for private sector partners to execute, right? So we're no longer visioning, right? We're now saying, okay, we've always wanted to be a key corridor into the hinterland, but now we need to do it. And we know that we've spent $4 billion building this container terminal, but we really need a key operator. So this offer is actually out in the market. We already went through an expression of interest. NIPDB was very sort of key in helping us run that process. And right now, the official tender is out, and we're getting various offers. Some of the ones we had seen through the EOI were fantastic, that this particular container terminal's capacity is 750,000 TEU. And some of the offers we had gotten through the expression of interest were looking to almost triple that capacity to 2.1 million, dredging, at the Walvis Bay port to 16, 17 meters, which is the deepest sort of level around the world, and making it a real transshipment hub. So that port logistics, then you begin to couple that with what we're seeing as investment opportunities in the train sector. TransNamib has come out. They've secured some funding from DBSA, about $2.something billion. They want to buy a specific amount of wagons and locomotives, right? So that they can begin to actually start bringing commodities even from South Africa. We're looking at iron ore and manganese, getting that off the road and onto the rail. You've seen us then beginning to do exactly what Conrad was saying, is sector coupling. So now we're infusing the synthetic fuels into those trains, and then we're doing what we do with the EIF. We're going to get blended financing to get cheaper money for TransNamib, because not only are they going to buy locomotives and wagons, they're going to start retrofitting them with technology that reduces their carbon emissions. So again, private sector working very closely with government. You've heard, obviously, what we're doing with the green schemes. I know there's somebody here today from the Ministry of Agriculture as well. We're looking to put some of these green schemes also out for concession, and with different focus. In the South, we have great potential for dates. And again, we don't just want to sell those dates. We'd love to add some value as well. And then with regards to renewable energy, not all of it is just synthetic fuels focused. The NIRP came out. Our National Integrated Resource Plan came out in March. It's been commented on by the private sector. And that gives an outlook of the various generation assets that we'll have to build all the way until 2040. And the beauty of it is more than 90% of these new assets coming on are actually either renewable energy or battery and storage systems as well. And so that's a whole interesting opportunity as well for wind and solar developers to produce and build assets that generate electricity for Namibia. Of course, a lot of what I've just said will have an impact on the construction sector. So the construction sector that got so decimated because it was highly reliant on public sector spending now has a much better outlook, because now we're bringing private sector capital. Some of the developers are in the room, and as they're spending that money, that should revive the construction sector, and that has a positive impact on SMEs as well. So as Conrad mentioned earlier, we could definitely talk about it the whole day, but I think the key message for us that we want to land in Davos, that we want to land back home, is the government is no longer looking to try to do all of this with our $50 billion budget.
Yes.
right? There's a PPP framework specifically that we've put in place, public-private partnerships. And again, when we saw we weren't getting the type of proposals that we were needing from public entities, we're now putting out an unsolicited proposal guideline that allows the private sector to be more proactive and saying, you know, you didn't think of building a gigawatt of floating solar on Neckartal Dam.
Wow.
You put together Neckartal Dam to create a green scheme. But we think we can put floating solar on Neckartal Dam, and we've got that proposal. But without those, the unsolicited proposal mechanism, the public entity would essentially have to steal that idea and pretend it was theirs, but it wasn't ours. And the private sector gets an advantage for suggesting that particular unsolicited proposal that we think is in the best interest of the country. So we think a combination of what I've just said gets Namibia ticking over a little bit faster, addresses Conrad's concern about execution, because it's no longer sitting with visioning at the NPC. It's sitting with private sector saying, you know, Trans-Namib, I will actually, by the way, these are some offers we're getting, I will actually buy some of the locomotives that you need. I will lease them for you because I've got offtake.
Yeah.
I've got 500,000 tons of iron ore that I need to go from this mine in Northern Cape to that port in Lüderitz, and I'll buy the locomotives, you can lease them, move my cargo, I make money, you make money. And so we're excited about executing that as well, Conrad. We're not visioning it anymore. You know, and hopefully, by the way, the other thing that we're doing to ourselves in government is we give ourselves very tough targets.
Yeah.
Not because we can do it, but because without them, you're comfortable. And we're very uncomfortable at the moment. We think the next sort of big set of targets that we want to hit, we should be announcing by COP27 in November in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And the port, for example, sooner than that. That should be around August. So yeah, exciting times, but as usual, the proof will be in the pudding. We have to start delivering.
That's excellent. I mean, it's exciting news. And you stole the words out of my mouth. I was going to say, it's exciting news. And then it's like, exciting news. So thank you very much, James. But before I go over and just ask, we've got some questions online. But before I do that, I just want to ask if any of you have just some final thoughts around competitiveness. Where are we as the country? I mean, we've heard a heck of a lot. I think we are already at sort of 8 out of 10, and maybe I'm being too ambitious. You know, at least in terms of turnaround, James spoke about the amount of hours that people are actually putting in to make sure Namibia gets to where it needs to be. So any final thoughts on that? And then I'll give some questions from online as well as the public in here.
Yeah, Margaret, I think it's, you know, you used the word exciting. It's definitely certainly exciting. There's a lot of people working very hard throughout the country. There's a lot of things starting to come together really nicely. And I think this execution that we talk about, it's already out of the blocks. You know, a lot of it's happening. And sort of when we talk to investors, we say, I think the investment case, the Namibia investment case for an investor at the moment is quite a unique investment case. There's not a lot of places around the planet where you can invest for the planet, invest for people, invest for global solutions, and at the same time earn a proper yield on that in an environment that is welcoming and enabling for investment. And yes, a few things we do need to get right and tweak. We're acutely aware of that, and there's work going into it. But I think for the early movers who's getting onto the Namibia story early, it's going to be a very rewarding journey.
Yeah.
And yes, that the phone keeps ringing more and more as more people start to wake up to the opportunity set that Namibia present. And I think as the ESG awareness around the world picks up as well, you know, there's very few alternatives in the world that provide such a proper, sound ESG credentials for capital to flow than what Namibia is presenting in the near future.
Yeah. Thank you, Conrad. What you said, rewarding journey for the early movers. Excellent. James?
Yeah, I think the one thing I want to say before we hand it over is, you know, what is really cool and exciting for me is when I see people like Anthea Angermund coming back to Namibia after taking a year away from private sector and saying, I want to work for government. Because government is doing actually really exciting things. I was speaking at the London Business School Africa Summit a couple of weeks ago, and the young Namibian students there want to come back, but they don't want to come back and go work for F&B. They actually want to come back and work for the presidency. This young lady finishing her MBA there was saying, I'd like to come and work for the presidency and take your job over. When are you leaving?
That's awesome.
And, when I thought she was kidding, she gave me her CV. She's like, you need to go. So it's amazing when young, dynamic, smart Namibians, I'm getting calls from Spain. People are saying, I'm finishing my master's. And they want to be part of this conversation. And that improves our ability to execute, right? So I know in Singapore pays their public sector extremely well. And, I know that a lot of us took, significant reductions in pay to work. But if we execute on this, we will earn the type of capital where we start paying our public sector servants competitive rates to private sector. And that's when Namibia will really, really start cooking with gas. And we're not far, we're almost there. And that to me is very exciting, yeah.
Awesome. Oscar, do you have last remarks? Any final remarks?
A lot has been said already. We can move on. Thank you.
Okay. So they say that there is one sign that your country is really doing well is that the people in the diaspora want to come back home because there's a compelling vision back home that they want to be part of. And without that, your people will stay back home. I mean, wherever they are, Spain, Egypt, wherever they are in the world, and say, I'd rather be here and contribute to something more compelling, especially with the young people nowadays. And so there's a question from Mr. Daniel Mowers. I'm just going to open up my phone. Davano Mowers. And I think Oscar would probably be well placed to answer it, but maybe I'm just being a bit presumptuous. We say that it would be helpful for Namibia to remain abreast of the global developments which are constantly and rapidly changing, especially considering the need to remain a global competitive player. How is the Namibian public and private sector gearing itself for the inevitable implementation of blockchain technologies in all sectors, whether it be financial markets, green hydrogen developments, and MSMEs in our country? I want to avoid discussion on cryptocurrencies because this often distracts the real value that blockchain in itself can bring to a developing economy. So I want to give, Oscar, are you ready to answer it, or are you? Oscar.
I'll start off, and the colleagues on the panel can add on. I mean, again, already in the question itself, heading in the right direction, that it's not about cryptos. There's more behind the technology than just cryptos. I mean, cryptos tend to give blockchain a bad name, but if we are to look at the power and the value that, yes, Namibia and the rest of the world will get in terms of, again, competitiveness, I mean, trade, what's behind the power of the technology of blockchain is just amazing. And in fact, I mean, we haven't even started to tap into all the possibilities of what we can do. But again, it's amazing because, again, even the conversation of digital transformation, you can already look at the blockchain, and there's a lot of paper that we can cut out of the system. But just what we can tap into the technology in itself.
Awesome.
Yeah.
James, did you want to add?
I did, actually. So I love that question so much. So I'm actually looking up a Namibian called Linda McLeod. So you guys should go look her up. She's on LinkedIn. So between Linda McLeod, a lady called Margaret Mushla, who works at CWP, and a few others, and Anicia Peters as well, we've actually formed a group called Green Hydrogen and Blockchain. And what we're looking to do there actually is to use blockchain to map the provenance of the green hydrogen. What does that mean? Essentially, you want to make sure that green hydrogen is actually green by definition, and you're going to use the blockchain registry to track from source to production to transportation to consumption the carbon profile of that molecule. And that's just one thing, for example, that we could do with blockchain, as was mentioned. I know many of you would have remembered that when the president launched HPP2, he put in place the 4IR task force, the Fourth Industrial Revolution task force. And I know when it came up, people said, oh my goodness, yet another task force. But these task forces are absolutely delivering. I know we've got our fellows from Bank Windhoek, so the Business Rescue Task Force was chaired by Tinus.
Yeah.
And look at the legislative suggestions that it made, right? And so wait until the 4IR Task Force will actually be having, I think, their conference in June or so.
Yes.
And look at how they would be looking to deploy technology and blockchain to advance Namibia's sort of cause for being a progressive nation. So, you know, I think that guy, I would ask him to go and look up Linda, and then we would love to work with him very practically, right? So not visioning again. And the reason I'm actually giving out names is just to be practical. You know, I don't want to talk about this theory. This lady, by the way, is like the representative of blockchain or global organization or something like that in Namibia. So Namibians are out there, and they are actually proactively reaching out to us saying, how do I work with government? Because, by the way, when you can trace the provenance of that molecule, it is worth more. And there's less question mark about, you know, how much carbon was emitted to produce that versus, say, blue hydrogen. And people are willing to pay a premium for your product. So it is actually a form of value addition, if you want to think about it as well. So interesting things happening in Namibia.
So Davano Mowers, you are invited to the group. That would have been my next question. Is this a closed group or is it an open group?
Namibia is a friend to all and an enemy to none. You know the president says that. He's open.
Awesome. It's an open group. So Davano, please reach out to maybe NIPDB, info@nipdb.com, and we will put you in touch with the committee that James was talking about. And I want to give Conrad an opportunity to just add.
Yeah, no, I don't want to James's point, some of that technology is already quite far advanced. De Beers is pretty much there in their research where we can prove source of a diamond, that you've got a Namibian diamond on your finger when you buy it in New York. Now, for a place like Namibia to be able to guarantee the source of a diamond, it's just wonderful for the economy. You know, the work is quite far advanced for trade in Africa under the Continental Free Trade Agreement to use blockchain technology for trade. The current process that goes through banks, yes, we like it because banks can charge for it, but it's slow and it's cumbersome and it's inefficient, and you can have a lot cleaner, faster, secure trade throughout the continent. So I think it's something that it's not the inevitable that's coming, as the question was put. It's in production and actually working.
Awesome. So, Mr. Moaz, I mean, there are obviously clear opportunities for that already. Things are happening in Namibia where that's concerned. So, join the board. I mean, join. We'll join you, James.
We're open.
We'll join you. So, I want to pose any to the public here. If you have any questions. Leon and Fred, if you have a mic, please, for the gentleman. If there's an additional mic. Alternatively, you can just come here. Okay, there is a mic. If you can just put up your hand, and then we'll take a question. So, David.
Thanks. This
If
is
you can just introduce yourself and where you're from, and then pose your question.
Hey everyone, I'm David. I'm the CEO of a company called Jabu Logistics. We're a technology startup. And when I saw the title for this presentation, I was very excited about what it means for Namibia to become more globally competitive. Obviously, we focused a lot of the conversation today on Namibia's resources, on how they're being used to create employment. But one of my worries is that realistically, a lot of the employment that will be created is a lot at the construction level, at a more blue-collar level. And for Namibia to become more globally competitive, we have to be investing always in jobs around technology development, software development, in the engineering around these projects that are being created. Surely, we will need not just foreign direct investment, but foreign skills, whether they're from neighboring countries or countries where green hydrogen, petroleum, hydrocarbons, all of these things are being done, to come implement them. But as a technology company, we hire 2 software engineers in Namibia and about 28 in other African countries. we would love to be hiring all of them in Namibia. We haven't found the skills. We are trying to train the skills. We're also trying to import some of the skills so that they can train the current skill set that exists. But what could we be doing more? And I guess, James, from a Office of the President perspective, but also Conrad and Oscar from being one of the market leaders in the banking industry and seeing all the stakeholders that you represent as your clients, what could we be doing more to actually and tangibly, in the short term, invest heavily into creating skills? Because as a company, we would benefit massively from being able to hire locally and keep those salaries locally. The salaries we pay in software development are sometimes 10 times bigger, 5 times bigger than what you would pay someone in an operations role. That's what the shortage represents tangibly.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the room? We'll just take a few and then, okay, in the absence of that, James?
Yeah, no, fantastic. So, you know, I think it's a very relevant question. Not a lot of people know, but some do know. You know, I'm actually the son of an immigrant, right? Like, I wasn't born in Namibia. My mom immigrated to Namibia and came with a grant from NORAD, and she studied the Fisheries and Natural Resources Department at UNAM. So I am living, breathing proof of what you're talking about. You know, they educated obviously hundreds and hundreds of Namibians. My sister went on to lecture at UNAM. I went on to employ people while I worked at Allen Gray, and now I serve the country from the Office of the President. So the way that story is now manifesting in the way we're crafting policy is in a fewfold. First things first, remember we spoke about the work that we're doing with the Harvard Growth Lab. So it's one thing for me to sit and say to, you know, DG Kanjo there, look, I think this is the right thing to do. But it's another thing to do in-depth research, which is what we did with Ricardo Hausman and his team at the Harvard Growth Lab. And they've given us countless examples, whether it was in Jordan, whether it was in various areas in South America, I think Chile and Peru, and others, to show how when they went ahead and looked at the immigration policy from a progressive perspective, there was quite... and the central bank did a study on this as well. And DG Kanjo there is showing me all the slides over there. But there was now you know, next time you must get him up here as well. But you can see how passionate, this is government, right? This is government saying, we know that we need skills beyond our borders. So first we did the research. After you do the research, you then go and start informing a policy formulation. So you heard me talk about the immigration control bill, right? That is coming on the back of, you know, because the president always says, right, we are a country that's led by processes, systems, and institutions. So intuitions won't cut it. So the CPC took that research to cabinet, and they say to cabinet, look, we really need to relook at our immigration policy, and that immigration control bill is coming out later this year. NIPDB went and did extensive research on these visa programs, right? And we've crafted our own. I actually sit on the board of NIPDB as an advisory board member. We've crafted our own desert visa program. And when you take that and the immigration control bill and you take that to cabinet, you start moving the government machinery in a direction, but in a manner that is informed, led by science, led by research as well. So we're certainly getting there on our part. And I think whether it is green hydrogen, whether it is large construction projects, whether it's software development, I always give this example. Look at Qatar today, right? They just finished a $200 billion CAPEX program, spent $8 billion building 7 or 8 stadiums for their World Cup. There are about 285,000 Qataris living in Qatar. And the population of that country is more than 2.7 million. So who built those stadiums? How do you host a World Cup in such a country, right? And you needed a very targeted, very visionary leadership that goes and says, I'm willing to bring in skills to help me play at a global level, way beyond my weight. And that's what we have to do as Namibia. This one project is 15,000 people during construction. They're going to build phase 2, same, and we think we can build 7 of those. Ludwig is 30,000 people. There's no ways we can pull this off without relaxing our immigration policies. And my last thing will be, when I say that, when I say this a few weeks ago, I was in the newspapers, right? Because people say there's 40% youth unemployment. Yeah. How could you even talk about importing skills when there's such a high level of unemployment? And this is exactly what the Harvard Growth Lab research was saying. You can bring in 5 or 7 people that can train and enable 10,000 people to get jobs. So it's about being targeted in the skills that you're going to get, the FDI and the capital that you're going to get to create mass employment opportunities. So that's what we're doing from a government perspective.
Awesome.
James, I want to add to that. I think, these things often, when the conversation goes, it's really about what are we doing in government. So what's the government approach and, what is policy? But some of the stuff at a very practical level, you can quickly change as well. So David, we have exactly the same problem you have. We just don't have enough people that can, feed our AI robots, that can run our robotics programs, run our advanced data processes, systems engineering, all of it. And we took a decision about 18 months ago to say, we're just going to create those jobs. The argument always used to be that we don't create the job because the skill isn't in the market. And we've sort of turned the argument around and say, well, the skill is not in the market because there's not a job in the market. Nobody is going to study or develop a skill which, there's very few ski instructors in Namibia. So, yes, but there's never going to be a job for that. So we've turned it around and we've created this development tech hub inside the organization. We're actually parking it next to First Rand. We've worked closely with Anisha Peters and a team at the 4IR team, with NUST, UNAM, and say, these are the kind of people that we'd like to start employing. And we'd love to start to get their CVs in. And we take people sometimes in at a very early stage and just sort of, take a bit of risk and start to put a bit of money behind it. And then quite interestingly, the phone starts ringing and there's some Namibian who just can't dread the London weather anymore and says, I'm coming home. There's finally a job for me back home. So it's actually a lot easier to turn around if you're just deliberate about it. But yes, if you today want to have 28 systems engineers in Namibia, they're not yet there. Yeah.
Sure. I guess it's, I wanted to touch on that, and maybe James can answer it and Oscar can add. But just from how are we aligning our university or our training institutions to actually make room for the ambitions that we have as a country?
Yeah, again, when you bring them into policy making, right? So, again, these task forces that we formed that people were quite skeptical about were about borrowing Tinus's brain and his ability to lead and plugging it into policy making.
Yeah.
Right? Anisha is like super busy, by the way. Right? So it's not like she just wants to sit in a 4-hour task force. But when you borrow her capability, she's traveled, she's worked in Google, Oracle. When you bring that level of Namibian problem-solving capability and the network, you partner them up with F&B. I think what you guys are doing there is amazing. Desiree, is working with you guys on that as well. You start informing policy, but with like hard, cold facts, right? So that's, and I think the president has been extremely deliberate on that, and people are missing the point. The high-level panel, 4IR task force, bringing me out of private sector, bringing Nangula out of private sector, bringing Johannes out of private sector. Pushing us to get the PPP thing going. Yeah. Putting all of this in HPP2, he's extremely deliberate, extremely visionary, and it's clear what he's saying. Government can't do it alone. So how are we doing this with the universities? The universities informing 4IR. You saw what we're doing with the green hydrogen side. A part of that, the 40 million euros, we didn't have to divide it like that. We divided it like that consciously. And 5 million euros was set aside not just for scholarships, but to really get the tertiary institutions thinking, geez, we don't have these skills to build electrolyzers. But as you'll hear tomorrow, we also even have the renewable, like we have minerals that we can use to build some of the equipment, the magnets, to actually produce this fuel. So we have like the whole value chain, but we needed to get those skills. So we took some of that money off the table and invested in that. And we are building the Namibian Green Hydrogen Research Institute, right? Awesome. taking Polytech and taking NAST, my bad, and taking UNAM. They've graduated now. NAST and taking UNAM, and then partnering them up deliberately so with tertiary institutions in Germany to start crafting the skills needs and then the adjacent courses to start gearing up our workforce. But ultimately, you have to work together to really unlock Namibia's full potential.
Yeah, thanks, James. And Oscar?
Let me add, I think taking the question, then there's something we have not fulfilled is our communication. Because there's a lot that we have been doing, as James mentioned, that also as a private sector we had to sit back and say, I mean, the task force is doing this. We know where blockchain is going. We know crypto is coming. I mean, again, in everything like that, cybersecurity is a real risk. I mean, our apps are being weekly updated. I mean, we can't be in a queue for someone somewhere to refresh our app for us. And we've been putting resources behind this thinking. But what we are not good at is actually going out there and saying, oh, we have these 10 graduates we are sponsoring, we're sending them quickly to Japan to update this. So it's one thing, and note taken, that again, we obviously need to be communicating to those still at varsity level that they know when they are done, they should come home. We actually have a pipeline there as to where work will be available.
Awesome. Any further questions from the floor? I've got one more online. Okay, so I'm going to ask this question.
That's like
I think brace yourselves. Feels like government is everywhere except fulfilling its core mandate, which is the creation of an enabling environment. The policy framework is one which glaringly needs rapid attention to deliver the jobs and the global competitive environment we're talking about. So when will government focus on its core job? And I think the way I want to channel this discussion is really like, how is this? We've been working on policy. I know that's happening. And so I think, James, just to give an overview of, again, as we discussed earlier, what are the policies that we are currently working on and how is that leading towards the development of our country? Because I think it's clear. You've touched on it, and maybe just to highlight it again.
Yeah. No, we'll highlight it again. And I think the one thing we'll also say is, we're a humble government, right? We understand the levels of frustration back home. We understand the high levels of unemployment that we're going through. We understand what we've just gone through with COVID and the drought as well. And so people want to see action. But also there's a sense I've gotten from various economists, right? That they're saying, look, government, be careful of crowding out private sector. In the petroleum sector, for example, they would say, but do you have to be in retail? I know with funding, they were saying, do you have to borrow so much from pension funds and do all the infrastructure investments yourself? Like, why don't you back off and create some space for the private sector? So if you listen to everything that we say today, President says we're hearing you, but we're actually doing that, right? But with the PPP Act, we're moving back slowly and slowly and slowly. We're saying private sector come more into tourism. Private sector come more into logistics and infrastructure. Private sector come more into financing as well, right? You can see where with applying the blended financing approach, by the way, that's also a policy. The Development Finance Act that NPC has led talks about an integrated national financing framework, right? Which essentially says, government, don't try and build all the buildings in Namibia. Try and actually raise money from concessionary capital somewhere else, raise ODA, like the grant funding we were talking about this morning, and use that money to build some of the infrastructure. So with NEPA, for example, the Namibian Investment Promotion Act, you can see that in the beginning, the comments that we got from private sector was, look, government is taking on too much power. That minister would have had the power to say, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Government listened. We took the draft back, and we are working on it to make it more competitive. So I think that particular author of the question, we are aligned with them.
Yeah, definitely.
With NIEB as well, essentially what we're encouraging our private sector to do is to say, join government in nation building. We need to sort of, obviously be competitive, but we also need to make sure we're not building a very unequal society. And we have to be proactive in doing that. In Germany, they would have pieces of legislation that actually legislate the board composition of companies, saying that a certain amount of board members have to be women. So we don't have to be scared to ask for a progressive society as well when we're in, in government. So that's NIB, that's NIPA. You've heard about the immigration control bill trying to bring in more diverse skills. And if you think about what government has done, one of the biggest, it's not even a policy, but decision we've taken was the formation of the Namibian Investment Promotion and Development Board.
Yeah, that's right.
That is like a very big decision to put private sector investment promotion at the core of the economic recovery. And that, the formation of NIPDB should encourage private sector to find more ways to proactively cooperate and work with government to get the Namibian economy going in. So I would argue there's a slew of policies that we're putting in place. The SEZ, as we mentioned, the other incentives that we're working on. Yes, we can move faster. I think any government in the world can move faster. But we can also just move as fast as we can get that talent in. So that person, whoever they are, if they can just come and join us and work from within, we need all the help we can get. Yeah. And then, of course, we'll get told our wage bill is a bit too high, so he must be willing to work for very little money.
Thanks, James.
But we need all the skills and the help.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So, one last question is that we got online. There are a couple of questions, but I think we're running out of time. So I'm going to leave that for answering, offline. Is how do we reconcile our green hydrogen aspirations and the new oil find, as well as NAMCOR's new oil venture in Angola? And can these two coexist in the context of Namibia? And then considering the fact that one of our biggest global challenges, problems, as Conrad had mentioned earlier, is climate change. Yeah. And we're finding that solution not only for Namibia, but for the world. So can these two coexist in light of that?
This is by now my favorite question on the planet. They ask us this all the time. And, we're in Davos, so I hope the world is watching. I'll give you my 2 cents on this. This coexists in Netherlands. Why is it okay for it to coexist in Netherlands? We've got Dennis here from Shell. Shell as a company is doing both. They're exploring for hydrocarbons, but they're also strategically investing in renewable assets and synthetic fuels. Their VP of, Upstream, is actually coming today to see the president at 3:30 to talk about just that. Awesome. So in Netherlands, they're repurposing their gas backbone to carry hydrogen, but Shell and Netherlands are still exploring what to do with their carbon-based resource. So that's one. Denmark is building a $32 billion green hydrogen island. Yeah, Denmark is a hydrocarbon producer. They're funding that green hydrogen island with wealth they've created from hydrocarbons. Norway has a sovereign wealth fund of $1.4 trillion US. Yeah. They had the highest number of electric vehicle sales last year. 62% of their electric vehicles, of their sales, car sales was electric vehicles. They're subsidizing electric vehicles using oil money. But they're producing oil today still. Yeah. But they're combining both. Namibia just launched a sovereign wealth fund with like 300 million Namibian dollars. Yeah. We may have some hydrocarbons, which, by the way, we didn't even spend the money to find those hydrocarbons. Shell, Total, and Qatar Energy did. Mulunga is a 10% free carry. So Namibians didn't proactively go and look for the oil. Europeans and Middle Easterns came to our shores and proactively found the oil. So what did we proactively do? We proactively put in place a vision to use our renewable energy to produce synthetic fuels, right? So I always find it interesting when people say the Namibian government is exploring for oil. We put out exploration licenses using our processes, systems, and institutions. Could you imagine a situation where Shell bought the exploration license, spent a few $100 million to find the oil, and then when they found the oil, the Namibian government said, sorry, you're not allowed to explore it. We would be taken to court. Yeah. And what does the president say? We are a country of systems, institutions, and processes. We don't make these decisions willy-nilly. There's a whole Petroleum Act that governs how to explore for hydrocarbons. My last statement on this. it is such an interesting opportunity for Namibia to develop both industries.
Awesome.
Yeah. Look at what the Netherlands are doing. GasUnie is looking to repurpose their gas backbone. Gas backbone is pipelines that transport all these things. Could you imagine a scenario where Namibia might land some gas in Namibia, use pipelines to transport that gas for power generation, and we might be able to use the same pipelines to transport hydrogen?
Yeah.
Now, that means hydrogen doesn't have to carry the total cost of developing that infrastructure all on its own. It might be able to share the cost of developing that with companies like Shell, Total, and others. So, and that, by the way, might mean that our hydrogen could be cheap.
Yeah.
Because economies of scale and not having to carry that backbone cost on our own, that might give us a competitive advantage.
Awesome.
And my super last point, because it's my favorite question.
No, because
Yeah.
we're actually having a discussion after this around oil and gas.
I'm giving them all the tips. My super last question: how do you crack crude oil? You use hydrogen. Yeah. So can you imagine Namibia producing a whole bunch of clean hydrogen that gets used to crack the oil? You're reducing the carbon footprint of the oil industry.
That's right.
Of course they have to coexist. And lastly, people should read Article 4 of the Paris Climate Agreement. This I learned from Benedict.
Awesome.
Paragraph 4 specifically says, emerging market nations, yes, we have to reduce our emissions, but surely at a
Awesome.
slower pace
All
than
right.
developed nations.
I think I'm gonna wrap it up now, because I do believe James has got a very busy schedule, and somebody the VIP is waiting for him. So I'm going to close off the discussion. I want to say thank you very much to the panelists, Conrad, Oscar, James. Thank you so much. I think it shows that Namibia is on her way to becoming a globally competitive player. And as Conrad said to me the other day, we must show that Namibia is here to play. We're on the play field and we're ready to play. And many of the names, for everyone that's not here, many of the names that James is mentioning are, some people are in the room, others are back at home, others are in other meetings. But please don't worry, he's really talking about real people. It's not it's not just anyone. So on that note, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for your contribution. And we'll see each other again after this session, which is the session on gas and oil. And we want you to please join us and take part in that discussion and continue James's input that he gave finally. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret. Cheers.